billionaire arrived at the shop in a wheelchair, driving a Mustang GT that had been adapted again and again to fit a life she had been told to accept. She was only 30 years old, blonde, elegant, and accustomed to a world where money solved almost everything. The mechanic listened carefully to her request, but he didn't walk toward the car. Instead, he watched her, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with the kind of attention reserved for things that don't quite add up. Before touching a single tool, before opening the hood, he spoke a sentence that froze her in place. "Your problem isn't the car," he said quietly. It never was. The Mustang GT stopped in front of the shop with a smooth, controlled, almost elegant roar. It wasn't the sound of someone hesitating, but of someone used to always getting where they want. The billionaire got out of the car with the help of an automatic mechanism and remained motionless in her wheelchair, dressed in an elegant red dress that contrasted with the dull gray of the place. She was 30 years old. Her blonde hair was perfectly groomed, and she had a look that had learned not to ask for anything. She had been to many shops. In all of them, she had made the same request. Adapt the car, hand pedals, special controls, precise adjustments. She wasn't looking for pity or motivational speeches. She was looking for functionality. The world, she had been told, was this way, and now she had to adapt to it. The shop she arrived at that morning had nothing special about it. Old tools, walls marked by time, a mechanic working in silence. There was no receptionist or modern screens, just the smell of oil and metal. When she explained what she needed, the mechanic listened without interrupting. He nodded, took mental notes, but didn't get up to look at the car. Instead, he observed her, not with curiosity, but with real attention, as if he were seeing something that didn't quite fit the story she had learned to tell about herself. "Since when can't you move your legs?" he asked calmly. She answered naturally, like someone repeating a diagnosis she no longer questions. Accident, doctors, years, treatments. The word irreversible said too many times. The mechanic remained silent. He didn't argue, didn't promise anything, just listened. In that instant, without her knowing it, something began to change. Not in the car, but in the conversation, because that man wasn't thinking about how to adapt a Mustang GT. He was remembering something no one else had wanted to remember, and he knew that if he told the truth, nothing would ever be the same again. The problem wasn't that she couldn't walk. The problem was that no one had asked her again if she really couldn't. At 30, the billionaire had learned to move through the world with a precision that many take a lifetime to master. She knew what to say, when to say it, and to whom. She knew how to arrive first, decide quickly, and show no doubt. Her fortune had given her power, but it had also taught her something quieter. When you have money, people stop asking how you feel and start assuming you're fine. The accident had happened years ago on a road she no longer remembered clearly. What she did remember was the aftermath, the white hospital lights, the soothing voices, the technical words, and above all a phrase repeated like a polite sentence. You will have to adapt. Adapting became her new routine. Adapting the house, adapting trips, adapting the way of entering and leaving places, adapting cars. Every adaptation was presented as a solution, and she accepted them all with a serenity many mistook for strength. The Mustang GT was a symbolic decision. She didn't need a sports car. She could buy anything. But that model represented something she refused to let go of, the feeling of control, of speed, of freedom. Even if she couldn't use the pedals like before, she wanted to keep sitting behind the wheel of something that didn't look like a concession. That's why she had adapted it more than once. Every new system promised greater comfort, greater independence, and yet every adaptation reinforced an idea she never said out loud. This is permanent. People admired her. A young, rich, elegant woman facing life from a wheelchair without complaining, always dressed with care, almost always in red. Not as a provocation, but as a reminder. Red made her feel alive, in a world that looked at her with excessive caution. When she arrived at the mechanic's shop, she expected nothing different. She had researched, compared options, read recommendations. She knew exactly what she was going to ask for. One more adaptation, a new adjustment, something to make it easier to keep going without asking too many questions. What she didn't expect was that the mechanic wouldn't rush. He didn't look at her like the others. There was no uncomfortable mix of pity and distance. There was no exaggerated kindness either. He listened to her, simply that. And when she finished explaining what she needed, he didn't get up immediately. He looked her in the eyes. "Since when can't you move your legs?" he asked. The question wasn't new. What was new was the tone. It didn't sound clinical. It sounded human. She responded with data, dates, diagnosis, doctors' names, years of treatments. The word irreversible appeared as always. The mechanic didn't argue, didn't deny anything, but he didn't nod like the others either. "Did anyone ever ask you to stand up?" he asked afterward. The question took her by surprise. "How?" she replied, bewildered. "After the accident," he clarified. "Did anyone ask you to try for real?" She frowned. She remembered physical therapy, routines, exercises. She remembered brief, controlled attempts, always interrupted by warnings. "Don't force it. Don't hurt yourself. It's not worth it." "No," she said finally. "They told me it wasn't recommended." The mechanic nodded slowly. "I understand," he replied. "Then, before touching the car, I need to know something else." She tensed. She wasn't used to someone deviating from the procedure, much less someone not wearing a lab coat or speaking in technical terms. "I didn't come for a diagnosis," she said firmly. "I came for an adaptation." The mechanic looked at her without challenge. "I know," he replied, "but I don't adapt things without understanding what I'm adapting." There was an uncomfortable silence. She was about to get up and leave. She had other shops, other options, enough money not to waste time. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not as a client, not as a patient, but as a person no one had fully listened to. "What do you think is happening?" she asked almost without realizing it. The mechanic took a deep breath. "I think," he said, "that you learned to live sitting down too soon." The phrase felt like a soft but precise blow. It wasn't offensive. It was unsettling. She didn't answer immediately. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't trying to make her life easier. He was questioning the story she had accepted as definitive. "I just wanted to adapt my Mustang," she said at last with a thread of a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "And we will," he replied, "if needed." Then he paused. "But first, I need you to allow me to look at something more important than the car." She looked at him, confused. "What?" The mechanic lowered his voice. "You?" That was the exact moment the story stopped being about a Mustang GT and started being about something she wasn't sure she wanted to recover, the possibility of standing up again. While everyone adapted machines, he wondered what part of her had been adapted without permission. The shop fell silent after that sentence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one charge was something neither of them knew how to name immediately. The Mustang GT was still there, shiny, imposing, waiting for one more modification. But for the first time since she arrived, it wasn't the center of the scene. The mechanic didn't rush to explain what he thought. He had learned over the years that important truths aren't imposed. They are let fall slowly, like pieces that fit together on their own when the time is right. "Don't get me wrong," he said after a few seconds. "I'm not a doctor." She nodded, as if that clarification were necessary to protect herself from premature hope. "Then, why do you say that?" she asked. "Why do you think there's something else?" "Wedo?" The mechanic got up and walked to a wall covered in old marks. the kind that only exists in shops where work has been done for decades. He took a wrench, turned it in his fingers, and hung it back up. "Because I've spent 30 years seeing people adapt," he replied, "not just to cars, but to houses, to to lives that broke suddenly." She watched him intently. There was no grandiose tone in him. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He was describing what he had seen. "When something breaks," he continued, "there are two paths: repair or learn to live around the damage. I repaired what I could," she said defensively. "I did everything they told me." The mechanic didn't contradict her. "I don't doubt that," he replied, "but I also know something else." He moved a little closer, always maintaining a respectful distance. "People with power are rarely challenged," he said, "and when they are also hurt, everyone prefers to make their life easier rather than make them uncomfortable with questions." She felt a pang, not of pain, but of recognition. "Are you saying no one told me the truth because I'm rich?" she asked. "I'm saying," he replied, "that no one wanted to run the risk of being wrong in front of you." The mechanic sat down again, not in front of her, but to the side, like someone who doesn't want to dominate the conversation. "Do you know how many times I've seen this?" he asked. "People who are told it can't be done too soon, not because it's impossible, but because it's safer." She lowered her gaze. She remembered the doctors, the advisors, the experts who spoke with quiet confidence. She remembered how little she had been invited to question. "And what do you think happened to me?" she asked almost in a whisper. The mechanic took his time before answering. "I think after the accident, everyone focused on avoiding you pain," he said. "And in that process, they stopped asking you to try something that might hurt, but could also give you something back." She clasped her hands in her lap. "I tried," she said. "I got tired of trying." "I know," he replied. "Trying alone is more tiring." There was another pause. Outside, a car passed on the road. The sound filtered briefly through the shop and disappeared. "I'm not promising you'll walk again," the mechanic continued. "I don't make promises I can't keep." She looked up, surprised. "Then what are you doing?" "I'm telling you," he replied, "that before adapting your Mustang, I want to be sure we aren't adapting a life that can still move." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "And how do you plan to know that?" she asked. "With a wrench?" The mechanic barely smiled. "No," he said. "With a question no one asked you." He leaned forward slightly. "When you wake up in the morning," he asked, "do you ever feel anything in your legs?" "Not pain sensation." She opened her mouth to answer quickly and stopped. She thought. She remembered isolated moments, ball sensations she had dismissed as reflexes, illusions, side effects. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but the doctors said it meant nothing." The mechanic nodded. "Sometimes," he repeated, "is where stories worth telling begin." She felt a nod in her stomach, not of full hope, but of doubt. And doubt for someone who had learned to accept hard certainties was dangerous. "If you're wrong," she said, "you'll waste my time." "If I'm wrong," he replied, "you'll be the same as now, but with one less question hanging over you." She remained silent, looked at her Mustang GT, thought of all the previous adaptations of how easy it had been to accept each one as definitive. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. The mechanic stood up, walked over to her, and stopped in front of the chair. "Today? Nothing," he said. "Today, I just want you to come back tomorrow without the car." She frowned. "Tomorrow, tomorrow," she repeated. "Without mechanics, without experts, without hurry." She took a deep breath. Part of her wanted to get up and leave. Another part, one she hadn't listened to in years, wanted to stay. "Okay," she said finally. "Tomorrow." The mechanic nodded. "Then yes," he added. "We'll start working." She left the shop without the Mustang GT being touched. For the first time, she had come to adapt a car and was leaving with something much more uncomfortable, the possibility that her life had been adapted too quickly. And as he watched her leave, the mechanic knew the real work was just beginning. Because fixing a car is a matter of technique, but dismantling a certainty requires something more than tools. Sometimes we don't recognize people because the memory hurts too much to look at head-on. She returned to the shop the next day without the Mustang GT. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was uncomfortable, thought out, debated with herself during a long night. Accustomed to controlling every variable of her life, she found it strange to go to a place without an immediate practical objective. But something in the mechanic's voice had kept resonating, like a question that won't go out. The shop was quieter than the day before. There were no customers, no noise of tools. The mechanic was waiting for her, sitting with a cup of coffee already cold in his hands. "Thanks for coming back," he said without getting up. She nodded, didn't smile. "I don't like wasting time," she replied. "So, be direct." The mechanic accepted the tone without getting annoyed. "I will be," he said. "But first I need to know if you remember something." She frowned. "What thing?" The mechanic set down the cup as if that gesture marked a shift. "The place where you had the accident," he said. "Do you remember it?" Well, she hesitated, not because she didn't remember, but because she had learned not to. "A secondary road," she replied. "At night, rain, a side impact." "Near an old shop?" he asked. She looked up sharply. "How do you know that?" The mechanic took a deep breath. "Because I was there." The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was dense. She looked at him intently, looking for signs of exaggeration, of opportunism, of lies. She found none. "That was years ago," she said. "Many people were there." "No," he replied. "Not that many." He got up slowly and walked to a back wall. From a drawer, he took out a small metal box, rusted by time. He opened it carefully and took out something wrapped in a cloth. It was a red pendant, small, worn. She recognized it before touching it. "That's mine," she whispered. "It was," he replied. "You dropped it that night." She felt a lump in her throat. That pendant had been a gift. She had lost it in the accident. She never recovered it. She thought it had stayed on the road amidst the rain and the twisted metal. "I helped get you out of the pier," the mechanic continued. "Not as a doctor, but as someone who was passing by and had a shop nearby." She couldn't take her eyes off the object. "The doctors arrived fast. He said they did the right thing, but I remember something no one else seemed to notice." She looked up. "What?" "That you tried to stand up," he replied. "And someone stopped you." She shook her head. "That didn't happen." "It did happen," he said softly. "I was holding the car door. You wanted to get up. You were afraid, in pain, but you wanted to do it." She closed her eyes, and then the memory returned, incomplete, fragmented. An impulse, a movement, hands stopping her, voices saying, "Don't move. It's dangerous." "They told me I couldn't," she whispered. "They told you shouldn't," he corrected. "It's not the same." She took a deep breath. The shop seemed smaller suddenly. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "Yesterday." "Because first I needed to know if you were ready to hear it," he replied. "And you weren't?" She let out a nervous laugh. "And now I am." The mechanic looked at her intently. "Now you came back without the car," he said. "Someone who just wants an adaptation doesn't do that." She remained silent. "I'm not saying everything is reversible," he continued. "I'm saying your story was closed too quickly, and no one opened it again." She clenched her fists. "I've spent years accepting it," she said. "Do you know what that bought him?" "Yes," he replied. "It costs less than trying again." The phrase pierced her. "And if it fails?" she asked. "And if all this is just cruel?" The mechanic shook his head. "Cruel is not asking," he said. "Cruel is adapting a life without checking if it still works." She looked at him for a long while. She saw in him something she hadn't seen in doctors or advisors. Emotional responsibility. He didn't promise miracles. He promised honesty. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "That you remember?" he replied. "That you don't discard sensations just because someone called them irrelevant." He stood up and placed the pendant in her hand. "This fell when you were standing," he had, not sitting. She closed her fingers around the object. The cold metal against her skin returned something she didn't know she had lost, a version of herself that hadn't been discarded yet. "Tomorrow," said the mechanic, "we won't talk about the car or the past, only the present." "And what will we do?" she asked. "See if your body remembers something," he replied. "Even if your head has learned to forget it." She nodded slowly. Leaving the shop, the world seemed different. Not better, not worse. Uncertain. But for the first time since the accident, that uncertainty didn't paralyze her. It invited her to stand up, even if she didn't know how yet. It wasn't a promise. It was a phrase no one had dared to tell her, because saying it implied taking responsibility for the result. The morning arrived earlier than usual. She had hardly slept, not from physical pain, but from something harder to bear. The idea that perhaps she had accepted an incomplete version of herself too soon. When she entered the shop, the mechanic was already there. He hadn't prepared anything special. No stretcher, no medical equipment, no setting that seems solemn. Just the same space as always. Clean, silent, honest. "Today we aren't going to force anything," he said before she asked. "And we aren't going to pretend nothing is happening either." She nodded. She gripped the brakes of the wheelchair with an automatic, almost defensive gesture. "I don't want this to be a spectacle," she said. "If it's going to fail, I prefer it be here without witnesses." The mechanic looked at her with respect. "No one fails here," he replied. "Here we just test." He approached slowly. He didn't touch the chair. He didn't touch her legs. He touched the floor. "See this?" he asked. "It's firm. It's not going to move. Neither will I." She watched him intently. There was something reassuring in his way of speaking. He didn't promise absolute safety. He promised presence before anything, and he continued. "I need you to tell me something with total honesty." She swallowed hard. "Tell me when you remember the accident," he asked. "Do you remember the impact or the fear?" The question disarmed her. "The fear," she answered without thinking. "I remember thinking that if I moved, something worse could happen." The mechanic nodded. "That fear was useful that night," he said. "It saved your life. But the problem with useful fears is that they don't know when to leave." He positioned himself in front of her at eye level. "You weren't born to be in a wheelchair," he said then, with a firm voice. "You arrived in it because someone decided it was safer for you to stop trying." She felt her chest tighten. "That's not fair," she said. "They did what they could." "I'm not saying they acted wrongly," he replied. "I'm saying they acted fast, and fast isn't always complete." The mechanic took a common chair and placed it in front of her a short distance away. "I'm not going to ask you to stand up," he said. "I'm going to ask you something harder." She looked at him suspiciously. "What?" "That you stop thinking about walking," he replied, "and start thinking about feeling." He knelt in front of her without touching her yet. "Close your eyes," he said. "Don't do anything else." She obeyed. "Tell me what you feel in your legs," he continued. "Not what you think you should feel, what you feel." Long seconds passed. She frowned. "Nothing," she said at first. The mechanic didn't react. "Keep going," he asked. She took a deep breath. Tried again. "Maybe pressure," she said insecurely. "Or heat. That's already something," he replied. "Don't discard it." She opened her eyes upset. "The doctors said that didn't mean anything." "Doctors look at averages," he replied. "I look at people." He stood up slowly. "Now," he said, "we're going to do something very simple." He placed his own hands on the back of the chair without touching her. "I'm going to count to 3, he explained. "When I reach 3, I just want you to make an attempt not to stand up to transfer weight." She shook her head. "And if I fall, then I hold you." And he replied, "That's what I'm here for." She looked at him. For the first time, she understood the true risk. Not falling, but discovering that maybe she could do something she had stopped trying years ago. 1, said the mechanic. She gripped the brakes of the chair. 2, she felt her body reacting before her mind. 3, she didn't stand up, but she leaned just barely, enough for something to happen. She felt a response. It wasn't full movement. It was resistance. It was tension. It was life. She opened her eyes abruptly. Did that really happen? She asked with a broken voice. The mechanic didn't smile. Yes, he replied, and it's not a miracle. It's muscle memory. She began to tremble, not from weakness, but from accumulated fear. No one told me this was possible, she whispered. Because saying it implies accompanying you, he replied, and that takes time. She breathed with difficulty. And now what? She asked. The mechanic stood up. Now we rest, he said. Today was enough. She looked at him surprised. That's all. That's all for today, he replied. Recovering what was lost isn't done all at once. She nodded slowly. Part of her wanted to continue. Another part was exhausted. And the Mustang? She asked, and almost out of habit. The mechanic looked toward where the car would have been. The Mustang can wait, he said. You cannot. She left the shop in silence. She hadn't walked. She hadn't stood up. But something had definitely broken. The absolute certainty that she couldn't. And that crack, small but real, was much more powerful than any mechanical adaptation, because for the first time in years, she wasn't sitting by habit, but by choice. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't getting up. It's convincing others that one has the right to trump him. The news didn't take long to leave the shop, not because the mechanic spoke, he didn't, but because she changed. Something in her posture, in her gaze, in the way she returned home that day was different. Those who knew her well noticed it immediately. Those who didn't attributed it to a good morning. She herself didn't know how to explain it. She hadn't walked, hadn't done anything that could be called measurable progress. And yet, she felt that something deep had moved, as if a door that had been closed for years had been left at least ajar. She decided to speak with her trusted doctor, the same one who had accompanied her since the accident, the same one who had always used a careful, almost paternal tone. I've been doing some tests, she said without going into details. New sensations. The doctor frowned. That's normal, he replied. The body sometimes generates residual responses. It's best not to give them too much importance. And if they aren't residual, she asked. The doctor sighed. I don't want you to get false hopes, he said. We've already been through this before. The phrase hit her harder than she expected. False hopes, as if trying were a mistake in itself. We went through it, she replied. Or you did, and I accepted. The doctor looked at her with surprise. He wasn't used to that tone. My duty is to protect you, he replied, to avoid you frustrations. She nodded slowly. And what if the frustration is not having tried enough? The silence was long, uncomfortable. Who is telling you these things? He asked finally. She hesitated. She didn't want to turn the mechanic into a target. Someone who didn't promise me anything, she replied. He only asked me to feel. The doctor shook his head. This can be dangerous, he said physically and emotionally. She left the consultation with a mixture of rage and clarity. Not because the doctor was cruel, but because he represented something bigger, a system that had decided for her when she should stop trying. That same afternoon, her family found out. Are you crazy? Said one of her advisors. You've built a stable life like this. Like what? She asked. Sitting adapted, he corrected. Functional. The word sounded hollow to her. Functional isn't the same as complete, she replied. Some supported her in silence. Others looked at her with fear, not for her, but for what it meant. If she could question her limit, perhaps others would have to do so too. She returned to the shop the next day with her head full of other people's voices. Everyone has something to say, she said as soon as she entered. Everyone knows what's best for me. The mechanic didn't look up from his work. It's always like that when someone stops fitting into the story the others were telling, he replied. She stopped in front of him. "And what if they're right?" she asked. "What if this leads to nothing?" The mechanic wiped his hands with the same worn rag as always. "Then you will have gone further than by staying still," he said. "That's already something." She sat in silence. The shop calmed her, not because it promised results, but because it didn't demand quick decisions. "I'm not going to force you to continue," he continued. "If you want to stop, we stop." "I don't want to stop," she replied without hesitation. "What I don't want is to feel like I'm disappointing everyone." The mechanic looked at her intently. "For years," he said, "you have been an example of strength for others. Now it's your turn to do it for yourself." She pressed her lips together. That phrase hurt more than any medical warning. That day they didn't do new exercises. They talked about the life she had built, about the public image, about the strong woman who never asked for help, about how hard it was to admit that something could change. "If I walk again," she said, "at some point, my entire life will have to reorganize." "Yes," he replied. "That's why it's scary. And if I don't achieve it too," she replied, "but at least it won't be a story that others closed for you." That night, alone at home, she looked at her red dress hanging in the closet. She thought of the woman she had been before the accident. She thought of the one she had become after. For the first time, she didn't feel that one replaced the other. The next day, she returned to the shop without announcing herself. She positioned herself in front of the chair, put her hands on the armrest. The mechanic was a few steps away. He didn't touch her. "Today," she said, "I want to try something else." He nodded. "When you say so." She took a deep breath. She remembered all the voices that had told her no, and for the first time decided to listen to another one. She didn't stand up completely, but her feet touched the floor with intention, and that, for someone who had been told never to try again, was a silent form of rebellion. The shop was in silence when she arrived that morning. It wasn't an empty silence, but expectant, as if the place knew that something different was about to happen. The mechanic was there as always without preparing anything extraordinary. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no hurry. "Today we aren't going to prove anything," he said before she spoke. "Today we are just going to listen." She nodded. She was wearing the same red dress, but something in her posture was different, not more secure, more conscious. She placed herself in front of the chair, looked at the floor, her feet, her hands. For years, that gesture had been automatic. Sit, adjust, continue. Today, for the first time, it wasn't. "I'm afraid," she said. The mechanic didn't try to reassure her. "It's logical," he replied. "Fear appears when one stops obeying." She took a deep breath, put both hands on the armrest. Didn't look at the mechanic. She didn't want to see approval or warning. She wanted to feel. "Don't touch me," she said. "Just be there." "I am," he replied. She leaned her body forward with an almost exaggerated slowness. She felt how the muscles reacted, clumsy, forgotten, but present. Her heart began to beat strongly, not from physical effort, but from what it meant. She stopped mid-movement. "I feel resistance," she said, surprised. "Not like before, because before you weren't trying." And he replied, "You were surviving." She gritted her teeth, closed her eyes, let the weight shift a little more. For an instant, nothing happened. And then something changed. It wasn't a clean movement. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't complete. But her legs responded, not as absolute support, but as a memory, as if the body said, "I'm still here." She opened her eyes abruptly. She said without finishing the sentence. "Yes," replied the mechanic. "You are standing not completely, not without effort, but enough." Tears appeared without permission. They weren't of immediate happiness. They were of grief. Grief for the years when no one told her she could try another way. "Don't tell me to walk," she whispered. "No, today I won't," he replied. "This is already enough for one day." She held herself a few seconds more. Each one was a silent victory. Then, carefully, she sat back down. She didn't fall. She didn't collapse. She sat by choice. She brought her hands to her face, cried without hiding. They told me this wasn't possible. She said that it was cruel to even think it. The mechanic sat in front of her at the same height. Cruel is taking away from someone the possibility of discovering it for themselves. He replied, "You didn't need certainties. You needed permission." She breathed with difficulty, then laughed a brief, incredulous laugh. "Do you know what's ironic?" she said. "I came to adapt a car and ended up reviewing my story. It was never the car," he replied. "It never is." During the following weeks, the process was slow, deliberately slow. There were no announcements, no public declarations. The mechanic insisted on something she learned to respect, not turning the attempt into a spectacle. There were good days, bad days, moments of progress, and frustrating setbacks. But she was no longer alone in the attempt. The Mustang GT remained parked longer than usual, not because it wasn't important, but because it had ceased to be the main symbol. Even so, the mechanic kept his word. He adapted the car, but provisionally. "This isn't forever," he told Wren. "It's just to accompany the process, not to close it." She accepted. For the first time, an adaptation didn't sound like resignation. Over time, she consulted doctors again. Some doubted, others were surprised. One finally listened to her for real. "We shouldn't have closed the case so soon," he admitted. She didn't feel rage. She felt relief. One day, she returned to the shop, walking with minimal help, not to prove anything, just because she could. The mechanic saw her enter and didn't comment. He continued working. He waited for her to speak. "Thank you," she said at last. "Not for making me walk." He looked up. "Then for what?" "For not treating me like a closed case," she replied. "For seeing me before my chair and before my money." The mechanic nodded. "It was never the car," he said. "It never is." She looked at the shop, the old tools, the mark floor. She thought of everything that had changed without the place changing at all. "Do you know what I'm going to do with the Mustang?" she asked. "No," he replied. "What?" "I'm going to keep it just as it is," she said, "as a memory of who I believed I was and who I decided to be again." The mechanic smiled barely. That day when she left, the Mustang GT started without problems. But it was no longer the most important thing that had started moving again. She walked out slowly, with help, with effort, with fear, still, but standing. And the mechanic from the threshold of the shop understood something he had always known. Moral of the story: sometimes it isn't the body that breaks. It's the story told about it too early. Limits are often accepted not because they are final, but because someone decided it was safer to stop asking questions. She didn't rise because of a miracle. She rose because one person refused to treat her life as a closed case and gave her something she had been denied for years: permission to try again. And often, that permission is where real change begins. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a part of your own life that was labeled over too soon, welcome to Momentum Stories. Here, we tell stories about hope found where no one thought to look. Subscribe, and remember, your story may still be unfolding.